Jessie Reese, our speaker tonight, is a senior avian ecologist with the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. She studied birds and their habitats for 15 years in such places as Virginia and Yosemite Valley to the Pacific Islands and Colombia. She earned her master's degree in science from Commonwealth University in Virginia, where she studied migratory connectivity, that is, how closely birds follow direct trajectories to common migration destinations for prothonotary warblers. Jessie has a passion for ecological restoration, which led to a job with the West Virginia Division of Natural Resources, helping landowners manage their forests to benefit Appalachian species like the cerulean and golden-winged warblers. She moved to Colorado in 2019, where she joined the Conservancy's program of multi-species avian bird counts at fixed locations for specified periods in Wyoming and the Southern Great Plains. Jessie also now leads the redevelopment of the Conservancy's Rocky Mountain Avian Data Center, a web portal with access to population trends and other data from more than 300 bird species. Jessie, we're pleased to have you as our speaker tonight. Welcome.
Thank you, Bill. Okay, well, thank you so much, Denver Field Ornithologists, for inviting me to speak tonight. I'm very excited to be here with you all to talk about one of my very favorite birds. Before we jump into that, I'd like to introduce you to the organization I've been lucky enough to work for the past 4 years. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, but if you're not, we're dedicated to conserving birds and their habitats. And we do this through a three-pronged approach of science, stewardship, and education. Now, before we dive into the dippers, when I was getting ready to do this presentation, it had been a while since I'd done one, and I have to admit I was feeling a little bit rusty. So I Googled how to give a great presentation. And what it said was that a great presentation tells a story. And as it turns out, the best stories are the ones that you know the best. So if you would please indulge me on a short detour before we get to the dippers, I thought I would share a little bit about my story as a biologist and an ecologist, about the different movements and migrations that I've done. So for about 8 years, I was very highly migratory. I moved with the seasons and I explored a lot. I got interested in birds in a college ornithology course where I was introduced to the northern saw-whet owl. And from there, I fell in love with banding, getting to hold exquisite birds in the hand, working in lots of places from the East Coast to the West Coast, and learning all that I could. Eventually, after a few years, I was lucky enough to start working in the tropics, first in Puerto Rico, then in American Samoa, and then getting to travel finally to places like Colombia and Panama and the Amazon in Ecuador and Costa Rica. And so throughout this journey, I was spending time in the tropics every winter, and then returning to my home in North America for the breeding season. And over the years, I ended up getting to work in all these different places. And so my movement was similar to some of the long distance birds that we love, who spend all summer with us in North America and then take their migration south to get to visit all of their wonderful tropical friends. And then in 2019, my life became really different when I moved to Colorado. And so moving here to Fort Collins, I quickly changed from neotropical migration to an altitudinal migration. And so luckily in Colorado, there's plenty of opportunities to make the seasonal movement from the high mountains in the summer back down to places here in Fort Collins in the Front Range in the winter. So altitudinal migration is a strategy used by the birds as well. Rather than flying north to south, they move up and down in elevation as the seasons change. And I've always loved the mountains, and having easy access to rugged and high peaks was a huge motivating factor for moving to Colorado. So I learned to navigate and scramble up peaks and push my skills in rock climbing. But what I soon discovered was that I didn't actually need to go to the mountains to find joy and awe and wonder in nature, because it actually was right here in Fort Collins as well. So that very first winter in Colorado, it was January, and I was walking my dog along the Spring Creek Trail, just like I do every day. And the Spring Creek Trail runs for about 7 miles through central Fort Collins. And as I was walking along, I spotted something. And it might be hard to spot in this picture at first, but if you look closely, you can see that I spotted an American dipper sitting on a rock in the middle of this creek, in the middle of town. And I want to play a short video clip of this bird. So you can see it's doing its characteristic movement there of bobbing up and down. And some folks think that dippers get their name because they dip into the water to forage, but they actually are called dippers because of this dipping up and down motion that they tend to do. And so I was so excited to find dippers here. It made me really happy and excited to find such a cool bird right in my backyard. This location is literally about half a block from where I live. But I was also surprised because I thought that dippers belonged up in the mountains. I was really used to seeing them in these very idyllic mountain settings with rushing streams, not in the middle of town. But if you have spent any time at all here in Colorado, you know that in the wintertime, these beautiful mountain streams look pretty different. They start to look like this. That is, they get completely frozen over in a lot of places. And so dippers move downslope in the winter to avoid these frozen streams and spend the winter in a place with open water. So I want to show you some maps here from eBird. And so can you all see my my mouse moving here?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, cool. So this map here is showing us year-round observations of dippers from eBird. And you can see these really neat patterns where most of the observations you can see are concentrated linearly. So this is the Poudre River, the Big Thompson River. We've got Boulder Creek here. And we've got lots of creeks here in Denver. I apologize, I don't know all your creeks in Denver as well as I do the more northern ones. Is this one Cherry Creek, I think, here? Yeah. So year-round, we see lots of dippers concentrated along the streams, but we also see them up on these smaller order streams at high elevation too. And if we compare that to winter observations, so in this map on the right, I've just filtered the eBird observations to show us just those observations between December and February. And you can see a really pronounced difference here where most of those places high up in the mountains were no longer getting observations of dippers. And there's a lot of reasons this could be. We know that eBird data comes from observations of individuals. And so, you know, maybe we have fewer observations up in the mountains because there's less people there. But what's really cool is to see all of these observations down here in the cities. And I went ahead and pulled the eBird data just from November. So I'm guessing that some of the folks who submitted these observations are here in this room. This one right here is the dipper that lives right by my house. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But so we'll come back to kind of the dipper distribution on the Front Range. But for now, I wanted to dive into a little bit of dipper ecology. Okay, so dippers live, as I mentioned, along fast-moving, clear, unpolluted streams. And we can really consider them to be a habitat specialist. They're very seldom seen away from streams. They're very highly tied to that resource. Even in flight, we typically see them flying up and down the course of the stream. And for a really long time, people thought that they never flew over land. It turns out that's not true. But it's pretty rare and hard to see them flying over land. They're mostly going to be in these streams. The American dipper is one of several species of dippers worldwide. And the American dipper is concentrated in Western North America, from Alaska all the way down to the Southern Rockies, but they also live down here in the highlands in Southern Mexico, and even in Central America in Costa Rica and Panama. And these highlands in Costa Rica and Panama are really special, and the bird life is really cool. Obviously, there's all kinds of really neat tropical birds there, but then you also end up seeing things like American dippers and acorn woodpeckers. And I remember one time hiking around and birding and thinking, am I in California right now? Because the overlap in seeing those species that I associate with the Western US was just so cool. So dippers have a specialized nesting strategy as well. They tend to build their nests on structures, whether that is cliffs, large rocks, bridges. They even nest behind waterfalls. And their nests are typically made with moss and are pretty round with a nice domed lid, a hole in the middle. You can see this fledgling sticking its head out, begging for food. And bridges like this are places where I might expect to find a dipper nest. And I want to show you this really cool video. You can see both adults have come in to feed the fledglings, the nestlings. And so that video was taken by one of my field technicians near Lander, Wyoming. And he was able to take this video because this nest was built on the underside of a bridge, very, very similar to this one in the photo. But the bridge had a little bit of a wider space between the planks. And so he was able to just stick his cell phone down so that the camera was underneath the the main part of the bridge and just record the video there without disturbing the birds. So really cool nesting strategy. They also have really cool foraging habitats. So this is probably the thing that dippers are the most famous for. So they eat mostly aquatic insects and larvae and even small fish. And they forage by walking, swimming, and diving. So here's another video of a dipper foraging. So this individual is first, clinging to a mossy rock under the water, sticking her head underneath. Typically, they're looking for those small macroinvertebrates that often live on the underside of rocks. And then at the end of the video, she swims away. And while we're on the subject of eating, there is some really interesting documentation of the types of animals that are predators of dippers. So there's actually documentation of them being eaten by goshawks and Cooper's hawks, which that makes sense to me, that those species might eat them. There's also documentation of a pair of ravens chasing a dipper, and one of the ravens actually circled around in front of the dipper to cut it off so that the other raven could gobble it up. They also can get eaten by great blue herons, but the most remarkable type of predator of the dippers are fish. There's actually two different types of fish that have been documented to eat American dippers, the Dolly Varden char and brook trout. And so some researchers were able to discover this after catching the fish and finding the dipper's body inside the stomach content. So pretty amazing. So dippers have a lot of really unique adaptations that allow them to thrive in this unique lifestyle they have. So they have extra dense and fluffy feathers that keep them warm. And if you've ever been to a banding station and gotten to see a bird in the hand up close, you might have observed that the bander was blowing on the bird, and blowing on the bird parts the feathers. And you might have noticed that typically bird feathers are going to be growing in what we call feather tracks. And so these are kind of like linear strips along their body where the feathers will kind of grow out of one area and produce, all of the feathers from that area, and it produces enough fluff to cover them. But dippers actually have their feathers in a different orientation on their body. Instead of having the feathers growing just in tracks, the feathers actually grow all over the place. So this allows them to have this really extra dense feather coat to keep them warm. Their feathers are also super water repellent. So you can kind of see in this video as the dipper is swimming, you can see the water just beads up off of their feathers, sorry. And so they accomplish that through special oils that they use to coat the feathers. Another really interesting thing about dippers is that in order to molt their feathers, instead of doing the typical sequence that a songbird might use to molt its feathers, whereby it's going to be a fairly slow process where they're molting, a couple of flight feathers at a time, and they're maintaining their ability to fly during that whole area. They just have a couple feathers that are a little bit shorter. Dippers take a completely different strategy where they molt many of their flight feathers simultaneously, to the point where they're undergoing so much flight feather molt that they actually can't fly. And so this is really fascinating. It seems to occur typically in August. And it's incredibly hard to find the dippers during this time because they're extremely vulnerable to predation when they can't fly. And so they'll typically hunker down into a very heavily covered area, really heavy vegetation and brush. And so I was thinking about all of these adaptations, and it really started to remind me of another group of birds who are also associated with water and have many of these similar adaptations. And it made me question, have we classified dippers wrong? Are they actually just ducks? I'm kidding, obviously, but it's pretty remarkable how they have convergent evolution around these lifestyle traits. One other thing I wanted to note about American dippers, I had for a long time heard and read that dippers were really unique because they have a nictitating membrane, which allows them to see underwater and protect their eyes. So a nictitating membrane is also known as a third eyelid. And it's basically a clear eyelid that can fold down and protect their eye while allowing them to retain sight. And what I learned recently is that most birds have nictitating membranes. Dippers aren't unique in having this. And what we actually see as what gets called the nictitating membrane is this white coating of feathers on their upper eyelid. And so if you have seen dippers in the stream, you often see them kind of blinking a lot, and you see this white flash really rapidly. And it's not the nictitating membrane, it's just these special white feathers. And we think that this is an adaptation for nonverbal communication because it's so loud at these rushing creeks. So I thought that was a dipper mythbuster fact. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the conservation status of American dippers. So this map that I'm showing you is from eBird Status and Trends, which you can explore on the eBird website under the Science tab. They've got these maps for lots of species. And basically the map is colored with blue dots showing us places where dippers are increasing in population. Red dots show us where dippers are decreasing in population. And the white dots show us where the change is uncertain. It's not statistically different than 0. And so you can see that, in the Pacific Northwest, I didn't show Alaska in this map, but a lot of Alaska is very red, like the Pacific Northwest as well. We're seeing declines. And then in the Central and Southern Rockies, we're seeing increases, which is really interesting to me. So I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into this. And so I looked at data from Bird Conservancy's kind of flagship bird monitoring program, which is called IMBCR, or Integrated Monitoring in Bird Conservation Regions. This is a program where we send out field biologists and field technicians to the Western US to go and count birds all spring and summer. And so here, each of these black dots is a place where our field technicians have done a survey. And then these colored polygons, we call those bird conservation regions. They're kind of like ecoregions. They're places where there are Similar bird species, similar types of habitats. So we can think of them kind of as an ecoregion and a unit. And so the size of these dots is scaled by the number of dippers we observed. So we can see large numbers of dippers observed in places where we have these really big pink dots. But for the most part, you can see that the vast majority of our surveys, we don't find any dippers, even throughout places where we know that there are a lot of dippers, you know, all through the Central Rockies here and the Southern Rockies as well. And the reason for this is that our surveys don't target any particular type of habitat or terrain. The surveys are conducted randomly throughout the landscape. And so what that means is that our probability of having a survey at a stream is fairly low because most of the terrain is not stream, it's upland. Streams are a very small part of the geography. And so consequently, we don't have enough observations from this program to really be able to make a qualified assessment of how the dipper population trend is doing. But one thing that I'm really excited about that some of our research scientists have been working on here at Bird Conservancy is to actually take these two types of data and integrate them. So we take data from a rigorous survey like IMBCR, where there's a probabilistic sampling design. So we're selecting the locations randomly. We're not just going to our favorite birding spot that we know there's going to be a ton of stuff there. We're going across the whole landscape. We're counting for a set amount of time. And we're able to account for a lot of things statistically because of that. So really high quality data, but it's expensive to collect. There's not as much of it as something like eBird, participatory science, where anyone can go out and count birds, but they're going to their favorite spot. So the observations can have a lot of bias in terms of where they're going. We don't know the skill of the observers. So it's possible that someone who, you know, is maybe newer is collecting an eBird checklist and they just don't know to look for a dipper, so they might miss it. So we have those two really different types of data sources. They both have advantages and disadvantages. And one of the things we're working on here at Bird Conservancy is developing statistical models that actually integrate these two types of data to allow us to harness the strengths of both data sets and accommodate for the weaknesses of either data set. So right now, we're mostly focusing this type of integrated work on some of our grassland bird species. We know those are in super high decline, but eventually we're hoping to be able to apply these models to many, many more species. And so I'm hoping that eventually we'd be able to get some better answers about dipper populations. So, you know, I said we'd kind of return back to dipper's distribution along the Front Range. So here on this map, this is a satellite map of Fort Collins. So if you've ever made it up this way, you might be familiar with Horsetooth Reservoir here on the left. And this kind of feature here that kind of divides the edge of the city on the east, this is the Poudre River. And so I wanted to show here eBird observations of American dippers. And so we have here just the wintertime observations from 2019 and earlier. So you can see we've got, you know, several along the Poudre River, several along other parts of town. This one in the middle of Horsetooth Reservoir. I think that location is maybe not super accurate because I don't think a dipper would be right there in the middle of the reservoir. anyway, I wanted to contrast that with observations made within the last 5 years, 2020 to 2024. And so, I'm seeing a lot more individual locations where dippers are being recorded, which is really cool. And I really was interested in looking at this because I saw those numbers from the eBird status and trend maps showing that, hey, dippers are probably increasing in this part of their range. So I was wondering, like, well, can we see that in the eBird data? The problem is that, just looking at maps like this, we don't know if we see more observations here because we just have more people out birding and more checklists. Notably, birding became very popular in 2020. So maybe we're just seeing more birders out there. Now, the eBird folks, they can account for, how many checklists are being submitted. So they can account for that kind of thing. But I think what I really wanted to point out with looking at these two maps is that we have a really big opportunity to learn more about dipper wintering ecology here on the Front Range. And so this circle here is the dipper that I first observed in 2020. And one of the coolest things that has happened to me in the past 5 years that I've lived here in Fort Collins is that every year there has been a dipper in this exact spot. The first year, I only saw it a couple of times, maybe 3 times throughout the whole winter. The year after that, I started, it still wasn't very common. I'd see it a couple of times. And granted, this is a trail. I'm walking my dog there most days. But starting last year, I started to see the dipper more and more and more frequently, to the point where I felt really confident that that dipper was spending the whole winter with a territory here on the Spring Creek Trail, just half a block from my house. And I was super, super excited just a few weeks ago when I saw the dipper for the very first time this year, for the 5th year in a row. Now, I don't know if this is the same individual. The longevity record for dippers is about 8 years. So it is possible that it could be the same one. And what's really interesting to me about this observation is the fact that this dipper is here along the Spring Creek. The Spring Creek is a very small tributary to the Poudre River. And yes, I have a map here on this next slide that shows that a little bit better. So to orient you here, this is the Poudre River here, so Poudre River watershed. And this is the Spring Creek River. So it really starts in present day at Horsetooth Reservoir and really just travels about 7 miles through the city here. And what's really interesting to me is that there are very, very few records from before 2020 of any dippers along Spring Creek. It's a little bit hard to tell on this map, but basically Spring Creek runs kind of diagonally through here. And in fact, just today, as I was looking at some of this data, getting ready for my presentation, I looked back at some of the other observations from 2020 along the Spring Creek, and I saw one from another birder in Fort Collins, Brendan Beers, and I noticed he had a checklist comment about his dipper, so I looked at it, and he had observed the dipper while on a jog on the Spring Creek Trail, and he commented that it was the very first time he'd ever observed one on Spring Creek. So his experience kind of matches what we see in the eBird data. So I think this is a really cool opportunity for all of us to learn more about dippers in the winter by just going out and recording these observations from within our Front Range cities and towns on eBird. Certainly, I will admit I don't submit a checklist every time I see this dipper, but I try to submit at least a few every season. And yeah, I think it's a really good opportunity to learn more about how this urban environment is beneficial to them. Okay, and so one of the other things that was really, really interesting to me about this observation of the American Dipper on Spring Creek was that everything I knew and was reading about American Dippers was saying that they almost always fly along stream courses. In fact, I read several things that said they only fly along stream courses. And that's what was thought for a very, very long time. And so what was really interesting to me was that here I have a dipper, and there's not a lot of upstream habitat for this bird to have migrated from. If we think about birds spending the breeding season at higher elevations and migrating down lower in the winter. You can see this creek here on the map. Buckhorn Creek. This is a tributary to the Big Thompson. So this is actually a whole different watershed than the Poudre here. And so I started to get really curious, how did my bird end up here if it didn't just fly up and downstream? Would it have come down the Poudre and then taken a turn? Would it have made an overland flight instead? And as it turns out, in 1983, a couple of scientists named Frank Price and Carl Bach published a very in-depth manuscript detailing an intensive 3-year study of dipper population ecology in the Boulder Creek watershed. And this is available online. You can find it with a Google search. It's published in the journal Studies in Avian Biology. And what they found was that about 10% of all the individuals that they banded throughout their study crossed drainages, which was really, really cool to learn. So over the course of the 3 years, they banded almost 600 individual dippers. And so they encountered about 60 of those in a different drainage than the one in which they were first banded. And what was also really interesting in this study is that the researchers observed a single individual take off from a stream, fly up into the air, fly actually about 60 meters high, and fly off. They lost it after a minute or so, but it was not flying over the creek, and they think, in fact, it was going to cross a ridge into a different drainage. And they hypothesize that that they do think dippers are flying over ridges rather than making those turns around the corner of streams. So it's super, super interesting. There's really just so much more to learn about these species. And so while studying dippers is not really my day job, I certainly have big dreams that, maybe one day we could work on a study to actually do some tracking of dippers in the Front Range and learn more about their seasonal movements, their altitudinal migration, exactly how they're moving up and down watersheds. And so I'm so appreciative of a species like the dipper that allows me to just engage with those types of questions and think about how fascinating the natural world is, especially when it's a species that I can see practically in my own backyard. So I just feel like so incredibly lucky to get to share space with dippers. And this series of photos were all taken by me, all with my iPhone. So they're not great pictures, but I think these pictures kind of encapsulate what it's like to see this bird. You know, sure, we can have like a nice cropped photo showing it in the habitat, but zooming out and seeing the infrastructure, you know, this is the Stewart Street Bridge by my house. This is all of the big riprap that they used to mitigate some damage from the Spring Creek flood. And, you know, this is another shot of the Dipper's territory here under the bridge. It's really obvious when the Dipper has come back because you can see all of its poop on the rocks. And so if you're new to Dipper watching, this is a really great thing to look for along rocks in the middle of the streams. And yeah. Another really good place to look for dippers in the winter is taking a drive up any of the mountain canyons, especially when the canyons get a little bit frozen over, but still have some patches of open water down in the lower canyons. You can start to develop an eye for seeing these little dark nuggets right at the edge of the water, where the birds will sit and forage, and they are really striking against the white of the snow and ice. And so I invite you all to play my favorite game as I'm going up the canyon to go skiing up at Cameron Pass or in Rocky Mountain National Park in the winter, where we try to spot as many dippers as we can on the drive. All right. So that is all I have to share about dippers. I just wanted to leave you with this thought about my organization. We are also in our end of the year giving campaign. So if you'd like to donate, it's monumental to help us accomplishing our work for people, birds, and land. So you can visit our website there to donate. And thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you very much, Jessie. What an interesting program and wonderful photos that you have to remind me of what a great place Colorado is to see these critters, the dippers. Thank you very much. How interesting that you're so close to a stream where you can see these every day when you're walking your dogs. Dippers are a special bird for me, seeing them in Colorado, but also I've been fortunate to see the European dipper in the Czech Republic. And the bird was along a stream, as you would guess. And they look quite different than our birds. They're bigger and they have a very pronounced white breast. But the habitat's the same, the dipping's the same, nesting under structures. This one was living under a bridge, nesting under a bridge, similar to ours. So that was interesting. And I'm quite familiar with the birds up at here in the Denver area, Lair of the Bear in Jefferson County, north of Morrison. There's frequently a pair there that nest every year under the bridge there. So it's nice to kind of seeing an old friend, as you say, magical friend nesting up there each year under the bridge, looking for it. Yeah, that's great. Well, let's see. We'd be glad to see any of you that are listening. You can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to relay any questions you might have for Jessie. Let's see what we have here. Just one question and one comment so far. Thank you, Jessie. That was very interesting. So that's nice to hear from somebody.
It looks like I see one in the chat. Since they forage on aquatic insects, are dippers an indicator of good water quality? And yes, they can be. Certainly, a lot of the aquatic macroinvertebrates are quite sensitive to a lot of different measures of water quality, especially dissolved oxygen, and things like sedimentation. So the oxygen requirement of those little aquatic critters is actually why dippers spend so much time foraging in like the very roughest parts of the stream. All of those riffles and falls, it churns a lot of oxygen into the water, which is really good for those invertebrates. And so they like to spend a lot of time there. But yeah, if the water quality is poor, you will not be able to find dippers there. And so I wish we had records going back, several hundred years from the Front Range, because another thing I was thinking about today was the history of mining in a lot of these waterways, and it got me really curious if dipper population trends dipped during the intensive mining, both from chemicals as well as sedimentation. Unfortunately, we don't have records from back then.
Okay, I have a question. How do you tell the difference between the male and female dippers? Are there any visible differences?
Yeah, I was wondering if anyone was going to ask about that, because I called one of the dippers she in the video. To my knowledge, there's not any external characteristics that you can use for the two. Although please someone correct me if I'm wrong. I meant to give a disclaimer that I just like dippers. There's probably people here who like them too and know just as much or more as I do. But behaviorally, I think during the breeding season, you might be able to tell from nesting behaviors. But yeah, other than that, I don't think there's a way to distinguish them physically.
Okay. How long can a dipper submerge underwater? And it says read article up to 2 minutes. Is this true?
Oh,
I don't know.
That's a really great question, and I don't know the answer to that one, but I am going to spend some time looking it up after this, because I don't know. I personally feel like I see them take pretty short trips underwater, although certainly if you've ever been to a place that has really like clear pools, I've seen them kind of swim for an extended period of time under there, but certainly maybe not 2 minutes, but it's totally possible.
Has there been any speculation as to why dippers are declining in California, the Pacific Northwest, Alaska, versus apparently increasing their population in the central and southern Rockies?
Yeah, I don't think we know for sure. And I think as someone who's, been an avian ecologist for the better part of, 15 years, I think trying to understand the mechanism of population declines is one of the holy grails of bird population studies. And so one of the reasons it's so complicated is because birds have such complex life histories. So For example, they could be declining because their nests are failing. Okay, well, if their nests are failing, why are they failing? Is it because the weather is bad? Is it because the nests are getting predated? Is it because the fledglings are not surviving? Is it because the migration is too challenging? Is there something going on in their wintering area? Something going on in their breeding area? Their fall migration, their spring migration? So it's very complex, and it's often multifactorial. Sometimes we can make guesses if we know a bird is a habitat specialist and that habitat, is declining. It's a little bit easier to say, well, I think we chopped down all the forest and now our forest species are gone. But it's rarely quite so cut and dry. So that was a long way to say that we don't know for sure.
Okay. Any indication that climate change is having any effect on dippers? Aquatic species that they are?
Yeah, it's definitely possible. We don't have strong evidence for that yet. But one plausible way that climate change could affect them is stream temperatures during the summertime. We know that stream temperature can really influence all of the invertebrates and the small fish that they eat in the stream. So we know that there's a pretty big impact on some of the fish species. So is that in turn also going to influence the dippers? It definitely could. I don't know of any studies that have directly looked at that to say for sure, though.
How about in your other studies worldwide, as you've been so many different places? What's your? I know this is a very broad question, but just what's your thought in general? I know grassland species, birds in general, have had a tremendous impact, decline, probably worldwide, but certainly in North America. What's your thought on, in general, I guess, what's been the greatest effect that you've seen in these various populations that you've studied in different places, as diverse as you've been?
In terms of like what could be causing population declines?
Yeah. Well, I guess habitat.
Yeah, I mean, habitat loss
is the big one.
Habitat loss is by far the biggest one, but there's certainly many things that all influence one another. But yeah, the human population has just expanded and altered most places. So I think that's also one of the really cool things about thinking about a species like the dipper that has been able to find ways to get along with human modified habitats, whether that's, being able to spend the winter at these low elevation streams in the cities, but also taking advantage of all the bridges we've built and using them to nest because it mimics the places that they like to build. So I think that's another thing that is exciting because being an avian biologist, there's a lot of things to be depressed about. So it's cool to see a species that get along with us.
Yeah, good to know that something is thriving. Yeah. What do you think? Say's phoebes that also use human structures for their nests. You think that how has that affected the population, if any, over time?
Yeah, Say's phoebe are a really interesting one. So we're seeing range expansion with them. And so this is a species that I will just throw a plug in for our new Rocky Mountain Avian Data Center, which is a web app where you can go on and look at population trends for more than 300 different species. And so I have been helping build this app for the past year or so, and it's just really cool because we've been collecting this type of bird monitoring data for, gosh, in Colorado, it's been 15 years. Other places, it's been, 5 or 10. But we have this amazing data set, and we now have this app where it's really easy to go on and look at it. And so I've been just looking at the data more because it's easy to do it now. I don't have to comb through spreadsheets anymore. And so Say's Phoebe is one that was really fascinating for me to look at recently, because you can really see in our data the range expansion and the population increases. It's not across the board, though. There's certainly some places that they're decreasing as well. So is it maybe just that they're moving to different places than actually increasing? There's still more to know.
Yeah. Well, it was interesting to me to show when you showed the range of the dipper down in Central America, including Costa Rica. I've seen them down in streams on the Talamanca Mountains there, mountain range that straddles the border between Costa Rica and Panama, and acorn woodpeckers. And
Yeah.
kind of strange to see those in tropical surroundings when in contrast to here in Colorado and elsewhere in their range, picturing them in montane species, rather than the tropics. That's kind of interesting. Yeah, kind of interesting when we have these notions of certain critters, and then we see them in very different habitats than what we're used to. Yeah. Well, most interesting program, Jessie. Nice, and keep up the good work with Colorado. The Bird Conservancy. It's a wonderful organization. I certainly commend it to anybody that's interested to support your work and others with the Bird Conservancy. Great, wonderful. Well, thank you very much. I think we've answered the questions that have been submitted, and it's been a delightful program. Thank you for presenting.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's just so fun to get to talk to folks about birds that I love. So it's great to be able to do it.